1990. Oracle was collapsing. The company's accounting scandal had wiped out billions in market value. Wall Street believed the company was finished. Employees feared the end. Competitors were waiting for Oracle to fail. Standing in the middle of the storm was Larry Ellison. His next decision wouldn't just determine Oracle's future, it would define his legacy. To understand why Larry Ellison refused to give up, we have to go back to the beginning. The beginning was the Bronx, New York, in the late summer of 1944. On August 17, a 19-year-old single mother named Florence Spellman gave birth to a boy. She named him Lawrence Joseph. The boy's father, an Italian-American military pilot, was gone before the child took his first breath. At 9 months old, the infant contracted a severe case of pneumonia. Overwhelmed by the illness and the social isolation of raising a child out of wedlock, Florence reached out to her family. She placed her son in the care of her aunt, Lillian Spellman, and her uncle, Louis Ellison. They formally adopted the boy, bringing him to a modest apartment on the south side of Chicago. Louis Ellison was a Russian-born immigrant who had anglicized his surname at Ellis Island. He was a strict, pragmatic man who made a living as a struggling accountant. But the household on Chicago's South Shore was far from warm. Louis, hardened by his own financial struggles, frequently targeted his adoptive son with quiet, cutting dismissal. He repeatedly told young Larry that he was good for nothing, a boy who would never amount to anything. Security was a concept Larry Ellison did not know. When he was 12 years old, the fragile foundation of his childhood shattered during an ordinary family dinner. With no warning and no pretense of gentleness, Louis announced that Larry was adopted. The news was delivered as a blunt fact, a sudden confirmation that he did not truly belong to the people who raised him. Instead of breaking under the weight of this isolation, the boy built a wall of fierce resistance. The emotional coldness of his home life taught him to distrust authority early and to rely solely on himself. Ambition became a shield against worthlessness, and control became his primary objective. The young outsider was already learning that the only way to survive a world that rejected him was to conquer it. In the classrooms of Eugene Field Elementary and later South Shore High School, Larry Ellison found his first real refuge from a cold, dismissive household. Math and science made sense when his home life did not. In these logical systems, the rules were absolute, objective, and entirely within his control. By the time he graduated from high school in 1962, his talent for mathematics had become the first truly stable thread in his life. He enrolled at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the fall of 1962, studying engineering. He excelled academically, even earning recognition as the university's Science Student of the Year during his sophomore year. But formal education could not contain his restless, impatient intellect. When his adoptive mother Lillian passed away in 1965, the fragile connection he maintained to the school broke entirely. He withdrew before exams and walked away. He tried to reset by transferring to the University of Chicago, where he attended classes from 1964 to 1966. It was here that he first encountered formal computer design and programming, but the institutional mold still did not fit. Ellison left Chicago without a degree, preferring the immediate feedback of writing practical code over the slow pace of academic lectures. At 22 years old, he decided he had outgrown the Midwest. In 1966, he packed his few possessions into a turquoise Thunderbird and drove west toward California. He arrived in the Bay Area with very little money, but the region was on the cusp of an unprecedented technological boom. Ellison took on early programming and technician roles at Wells Fargo to keep himself afloat. He soon transitioned to Ampex, an electronics pioneer in Redwood Shores. At Ampex, he worked on mainframe computer systems, managing massive, complex data storage projects. He was still a restless, untested young programmer, but he was now operating at the center of the emerging tech industry, learning the limitations of current systems and waiting for the right moment to strike. In 1970, an IBM researcher named Edgar F. Codd published a paper that quietly challenged the entire computer industry. Titled, "A Relational Model of Data for Large Shared Databanks," the document proposed a radical new way to organize information. At the time, databases were rigid, hierarchical structures. Finding a single piece of data required tracing through a labyrinth of predefined pathways, a process that was slow, complex, and highly impractical. Codd's paper offered a mathematical solution, organizing data into simple, interconnected tables that anyone could query using basic logic. But IBM, the very company that employed Codd, hesitated. They were heavily invested in their existing, highly profitable hierarchical database systems and feared that a new technology would cannibalize their own sales. It was a classic corporate blind spot. IBM kept the research confined to academic labs, building a slow prototype called System R, but failing to commercialize it. While working at Ampex, Larry Ellison read Codd's paper. Where IBM saw an academic curiosity that threatened their current balance sheet, Ellison saw a massive business opportunity. He saw that the future of business computing belonged to whoever could access data instantly. The intellectual timing was perfect. Ellison realized that a small, nimble team could build a commercial relational database before the lumbering giant at IBM ever decided to act. He did not invent the relational model, but he possessed the foresight to recognize its market value before the rest of the industry even understood the question. This technical theory would become the foundation of his future enterprise. On June 16, 1977, Larry Ellison, Bob Miner, and Ed Oates pooled their resources to incorporate software development laboratories in Santa Clara, California. They started with a modest capital contribution of $1,500. While Ellison was the salesman with the forward-looking vision, Miner was the quiet programming genius, and Oates brought key systems engineering expertise. Together, they set up shop in the Redwood Shores area, working on a shoestring budget of $400 a month. Their opportunity came from a familiar connection. While at Ampex, Ellison had worked on a database project for the Central Intelligence Agency. Now the fledgling startup pitched the CIA a relational database built on Edgar Codd's theoretical model. They won the contract, securing an important initial deal worth over $1 million. The CIA's code name for the project was Oracle. This contract provided immediate cash flow and instant legitimacy. It proved their database could solve real problems. While IBM hesitated to commercialize Codd's work, the small team began building a database engine designed to run on affordable mini-computers like the DEC-PDP-11. Ellison understood the power of a compelling brand. In 1979, the founders renamed the company Relational Software Incorporated, and by 1982, they officially adopted the name of their first CIA project, Oracle. Ellison had moved beyond imagining a technical revolution. He now had a paying customer, a brilliant engineering team, and a brand that would soon challenge the largest giants in the computer industry. He was selling a future that his team was actively coding into existence. The decade of the 1980s brought a structural transformation to global business. Mainframes and mini-computers were no longer just calculators for payroll. They became the nerve centers of corporate operations. Financial institutions, telecommunications companies, and multinational corporations were suddenly drowning in records, transactions, and customer data. They desperately needed a way to query this information in real time, and Oracle owned the exact tool they required. As the demand for relational databases exploded, the corporate machine that Larry Ellison built began to scale with terrifying speed. Oracle moved systematically from version to version, adding essential features like read consistency, multi-user transaction support, and broad compatibility. By rewriting the database in the C programming language, Oracle ensured its software could run on almost any computer architecture, specifically targeting the emerging Unix market. This technical agility stood in stark contrast to IBM. The hardware giant continued to move slowly, cautious of disrupting its highly profitable legacy hierarchical database systems. IBM's hesitation created a massive commercial vacuum, and Ellison's sales force filled it immediately. Oracle's sales representatives became legendary for their high-pressure, win-at-all-cost tactics, frequently securing enterprise contracts by licensing software still in the final stages of development. By the middle of the decade, the gamble had paid off. The software was no longer a startup novelty. It was essential corporate infrastructure. In June 1986, Oracle went public on the stock market, raising $31.5 million. The company that had started with a $1,500 capital contribution was now a Wall Street heavyweight. A new power had officially arrived in Silicon Valley, and it was structured to run over anything in its way. On March 23, 1990, the momentum ground to a sudden, violent halt. Auditors disallowed $15 million in recognized sales, exposing a systemic pattern of premature revenue booking. The hyper-aggressive sales culture, which had driven the company's meteoric rise throughout the previous decade, had finally fractured under its own weight. Representatives had been recording future promises as current victories, selling software that was still being written and counting it on the balance sheet. The public blow fell on April 5, 1990, when the New York Times published a detailed report exposing the surprise earnings hit. Wall Street responded with immediate fury. Oracle's stock plunged 12% in 2 weeks, erasing nearly $2 billion in shareholder value. Investors who had once championed the Silicon Valley darling transformed into hostile observers overnight. The trust was gone. The situation worsened on September 26, 1990, when Oracle formally announced it would restate its financials. The company was staring at the threat of near bankruptcy, with credit lines tightening and cash reserves drying up. To stabilize the listing ship, Ellison brought in Jeffrey Henley as the new chief financial officer. Henley represented a cold, sober reality. He was hired to enforce rigid financial controls and maintain survival rather than chase rapid growth. With each passing week, the public pressure on Ellison himself intensified. Industry observers openly questioned whether his aggressive leadership style was suited for a mature corporation or if he would be forced out entirely. The cost of this correction was paid directly by the workforce. Ellison authorized a 10% staff reduction, laying off approximately 400 employees across engineering, sales, and support. The celebratory atmosphere of Redwood Shores evaporated. The legal fallout lingered for years. Shareholder lawsuits accusing the firm of securities fraud mounted, eventually culminating in a $24 million settlement in February 1993. The era of unchecked arrogance was over. Oracle was no longer fighting to conquer the technology world, it was fighting simply to live through the night. The blood in the water attracted the giants. By the early 1990s, Oracle was no longer the invisible disruptor operating in the shadows of the database market. It was a wounded target with a multi-billion-dollar bullseye on its back. As the company struggled to restate its earnings and rebuild its shattered credibility, its fiercest competitors moved to turn those structural fractures into commercial advantages. IBM, which had once ignored the relational model, poured massive resources into its DB2 platform, determined to reclaim its database crown. Microsoft aggressively pushed its SQL server into the lower end of the market, offering cheap, accessible alternatives that threatened Oracle's mid-market foundation. At the same time, European giant SAP began locking down the enterprise application layer, creating a software ecosystem that threatened to make Oracle's database a secondary utility. Every rival Salesforce in the industry armed itself with Oracle's financial disclosures, using the threat of corporate instability to scare enterprise customers away from long-term licensing contracts. Inside Redwood Shores, the external siege transformed Ellison's management style from demanding to combative. The public conversation shifted from Oracle software to its founder's volatile temperament. Press reports painted a picture of a hostile workplace, detailing brutal closed-door meetings where Ellison berated underperforming executives. He dismissed the public criticism, viewing the intense internal friction as a practical tool to force greatness from a faltering workforce. To survive, Oracle had to shed its identity as a chaotic startup and restructure into a disciplined, hardened corporate machine. The freewheeling sales culture of the 1980s was systematically dismantled, replaced by rigid financial controls. Ellison realized that to defeat the enemies circling his perimeter, he could no longer rely on future promises. He had to build an impenetrable fortress, and he had to become its most ruthless general. The turn of the millennium brought an unprecedented speculative frenzy, culminating in the sudden collapse of the dot-com bubble in 2000. As internet startups folded and technology valuations cratered, a severe freeze settled over Silicon Valley. Most enterprise software giants retreated into survival mode, slashing budgets and halting expansion to appease nervous investors. Oracle was not immune to the shockwaves. By August 2001, its stock plunged 20% in a single week, erasing tens of billions of dollars in market capitalization overnight. But where others saw a crisis, Larry Ellison saw an opening. His reaction to the market crash permanently altered the strategic DNA of his company. Ellison rejected the standard playbook of retreat and defense, deciding instead to use Oracle's healthy cash reserves to go on the offensive. He believed that the economic wreckage had artificially depressed the prices of highly valuable software companies, creating an unprecedented opportunity to buy out competitors at a steep discount. While rival firms scaled back, Oracle adopted the posture of a predator. Under immense pressure, Ellison's strategic philosophy crystallized. To survive the post-crash era, he believed Oracle had to abandon its traditional reliance on organic growth and aggressively acquire its way to absolute dominance. It was a high-risk gamble that required heavy borrowing, intense board negotiations, and a complete rejection of passive corporate behavior. Wall Street analysts openly questioned the wisdom of buying up rival firms during an industry-wide contraction, but Ellison remained unmoved by the skepticism of the market. The board faced a stark choice between safe capital conservation and extreme market exposure. Ellison chose exposure. He began laying the groundwork for a series of massive, cash-heavy corporate takeovers that would shock the industry. The era of the cautious database provider was officially over. Oracle was quietly gathering its resources, hardening its resolve, and preparing for a massive corporate battle that would rewrite the rules of enterprise technology. By the turn of the century, a fundamental shift occurred in how global corporations handled their data. Oracle had evolved past a database program running on a server. It was now the foundation of global commerce. Banks, telecommunications networks, airlines, and retail giants built their daily operations directly on top of Oracle's relational engine. These databases ran far beneath the surface of simple file storage. Every credit card transaction, every inventory update, and every customer record flowed through Oracle tables. Pulling Oracle out of an enterprise system was no longer a simple software uninstallation. It was equivalent to extracting the nervous system from a living organism. Corporate technology departments realized that migrating to a competitor was both economically prohibitive and operationally catastrophic. This extreme level of dependency redefined Oracle's market position. Ellison's company had grown past the stage of a tech competitor fighting for market share. It operated as a digital utility. The firm's ultimate advantage was no longer technical performance alone, but strategic lock-in. Once a global bank committed its ledger to Oracle, that relationship became effectively permanent. Oracle's sales teams used this advantage to secure their position. They began selling massive packages of business software, handling everything from payroll to supply chains, knowing that clients would pay premium license fees to keep their core database stable. The software had become an unavoidable cost of doing modern business, acting as a technological tax on global trade. Oracle was no longer competing to prove its worth. It was operating from a position of absolute necessity. On June 6, 2003, Larry Ellison launched an unsolicited $5.1 billion cash bid to buy PeopleSoft. The target company was headed by Craig Conway, a former Oracle executive who understood his former boss's aggressive tendencies. Conway publicly fired back, calling the hostile bid a diabolical attempt to disrupt their business. For 18 months, Ellison refused to retreat. When the Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit in 2004 to block the merger, Ellison and his executive vice president, Safra Catz, fought back in federal court. Oracle systematically raised its bid, eventually securing PeopleSoft for $10.3 billion in January 2005. Ellison did not just buy a competitor, he forcibly absorbed its market share, proving that confrontation was an effective business strategy. 4 years later, Ellison aimed even higher, moving from software consolidation to hardware control. On April 20, 2009, Oracle agreed to acquire Sun Microsystems in a deal valued at $7.4 billion. While Sun was a struggling systems maker, it possessed assets that were essential to the future of the Internet. The acquisition gave Oracle ownership of the Solaris operating system and the Java programming language. Java was the engine running on billions of devices in nearly every major enterprise system. Controlling Java changed Oracle's position in the technology stack. the company moved past simply managing databases at the bottom of a system. By owning Java, Oracle gained direct influence over the programming environment that powered global computing. This allowed Ellison to engineer a fully integrated stack, locking customers into an ecosystem where the database, the operating system, and the development language were all owned by a single, uncompromising master. Safra Catz, who joined Oracle in 1999 and rose to sole chief executive in 2019, provided the financial discipline required to navigate the company's ultimate transformation. Under her execution, Oracle began migrating its massive on-premises database empire into the cloud, challenging established infrastructure giants. This shift required a complete restructuring of the company's business model. Instead of selling upfront database licenses, Oracle focused on cloud services and infrastructure. By the close of fiscal year 2026, the strategy proved its scale. Total corporate revenue climbed to $67.4 billion, driven by a cloud application and infrastructure growth rate that surged past 40%. The company survived not by protecting its historic database identity, but by systematically replacing it. For Larry Ellison, this successful transition translated into unprecedented personal wealth. His fortune, tied directly to Oracle's equity, experienced historic surges as Wall Street responded to the cloud expansion. In July 2025, his net worth reached $251.2 billion. Just 2 months later, in September 2025, a massive single-day stock rally pushed his net worth to $393 billion, briefly making him the richest person on Earth. While market volatility later settled his fortune back to $251.2 billion in 2026, the financial scale of his achievement was undeniable. The boy from Chicago's South Side, once dismissed by his adoptive father as good for nothing, had built a self-sustaining empire. Through relentless competition and continuous adaptation, Oracle outlasted its original rivals, evolving from a fast-moving database startup into an enduring global institution. To Larry Ellison, competition was oxygen. He built Oracle on the premise that the corporate world is a battlefield where only one survivor claims the prize. He consistently gravitated toward bets others dismissed as reckless, whether committing a two-person startup to a massive CIA contract or risking billions to forcibly absorb a hostile rival. For Ellison, winning mattered as an absolute principle, far beyond financial returns. It was the ultimate vindication against every voice that had ever doubted him. He structured Oracle's entire corporate culture around this raw, Darwinian philosophy. He deliberately applied intense, unrelenting pressure on his teams, operating under the conviction that pressure produces advantage. In his world, stability breeds complacency, and complacency is a precursor to defeat. By refusing to play by the polite rules of Silicon Valley, he turned paranoia into a competitive edge, proving that the greatest danger in global technology is avoiding risk altogether. Survival in the technology sector requires a perspective that stretches across decades rather than financial quarters. Ellison built his enterprise by seeking out specialized minds capable of translating his massive ambitions into structured, scalable realities. He treated the catastrophic accounting collapse of 1990 not as a permanent defeat, but as raw operational data to recalibrate the entire corporate machine. This calculated patience found its ultimate expression on the open ocean. Ellison brought his demand for systematic perfection to America's Cup sailing, treating yacht design as an engineering problem that could be solved through technology. In 2010, his team abandoned traditional soft sails, risking millions on a giant rigid wing sail that dominated the competition. 3 years later, facing an 8-1 deficit against Team New Zealand, Oracle Team USA systematically executed 8 consecutive victories to secure the cup. For Ellison, the water was simply another arena where victory belonged to the strategist who designed the most efficient system and refused to yield to the elements. Today, the modern world runs on the very data structures Ellison fought to build. As the battle for artificial intelligence intensifies, Oracle remains the quiet engine behind the curtain. Ellison proved that the greatest risk is playing by rules written by others. The ultimate outsider didn't just join the establishment, he rebuilt it in his own image. Share your thoughts on his legacy below and subscribe for more.